Good morning, afternoon, and evening. My name is Maria Schell, and I live in Anchorage, Alaska, and it's morning here. I'm really excited and grateful to be part of this presentation and this global SAQA exhibition, Opposites Attract. So if we want to take a look at our first slide, which is an image of my quilt called Trance, and it is basically opposites as in black and white, and what the potential for vibration and optical excitement really just that come out of those opposites. Trance is part of a larger series that I call color grids. And if we want to look at the next slide, and these are all four maquettes, which are small sort of sketches based on, there's a couple different ways that you can look at it. I think of it, the quilt block, you can call it a cross square. There's some other names for it. That's the one I tend to call it. You can also call it an uneven an uneven 7 patch, sorry. So you've got the 4 patches in the corners that are all usually the same information, and then the grid that they're built into, which in this case, a couple of these have different information going horizontally from what's happening vertically. So I've done a lot of these smaller pieces, and sometimes I blow them up to larger pieces, or sometimes I combine them into a larger piece, which is what this next quilt is. This is called Dance Party, and it is 9 individual color grids with, they all have their own compositions, but the grids and the squares, which are often called housetop blocks, are the same size almost, and so they form this grid. Occasionally, I should say actually more often than occasionally, I'll find a quilt block that I really like, and then I'll multiply it out. So if we look at the middle left block, and I decided to multiply it out, and we can see that quilt in the next slide. And it is called Citizens United. And to me, it's fascinating how when you multiply it out, it's the same information, but the multiplication of it creates this intensity that doesn't necessarily exist when it's just one block. There was a point where I really wanted to make a bunch of these and display them in a large grid, and I had an opportunity to do that, and we can look at that in the next slide. This is 9 of my color grid quilts displayed at the Bellevue Art Museum in Bellevue, Washington, as part of, they have a biennale, obviously every other year. This particular year, it was fiber. They focus on a different craft every other year, and it was super fun to see all of them displayed together. One thing I realized is that you can tell they're not all the same size. When I was working on them, it just didn't register to me because I was working from photos, and they all looked the same size in the photo. And then the point where I realized they weren't the same size, I was too far down in the exhibition process to change things. We'll take a look at the next slide. So this quilt's called Boulevard, and it is an elongation of the quilt block that I've been working with. And the grid is the same, but each housetop block has different information in it. And another thing I like to do is that if I really like the information in a housetop block, I will also multiply it out. And we can take a look at that in this next slide. There's 2 different quilts that are, oh, I don't know, Lucy, can we go back 1 second? So if you look at the lower left-hand corner, you'll see that quilt block, which I really liked, and I wanted to multiply out. So now I'm going to go forward again. And here I multiplied it out once, and then I multiplied it out 4 times to get the larger quilt. So the one on the left is called Way to Graces, and the larger quilt with the multiplication of the blocks is called Tribe. Next slide, please. So this quilt has, it's similar to that Dance Party quilt we looked at the beginning, in that it's 9 individual blocks where the gridding is the same size and the housetop blocks are the same size. I don't know if all of you recognize the very center block is actually the Trance quilt, where it's just 1 block, but in Trance I've multiplied it out. So each one of these quilts has a 12-inch version, an 18-inch version, I'm multiplying out, which is what trance is, and then this final quilt, which is called Wall of Sound. And I did that as part of an exhibition that was in Ohio. Look at the next quilt. Next slide, please. This is me taking that quilt block and making it as small as I possibly can. This quilt is almost entirely composed of little teeny cross squares that are made out of vintage scrap fabrics that I primarily purchased on eBay. I have a system for making them in groups of about 7 at a time. And this quilt was part of Quilt National 2015. We'll look at the next slide. Now this quilt is actually, it's all house tops without the grid in between all of them. And it's called Mosh Pit at the Golden. And I've been teaching a lot, and as I started teaching, I really wanted to incorporate some of the things that I explore in my classes. So this has a lot more patterning. It's a lot more, I mean, I know people think my work is chaotic, but this is sort of pushing that edge of chaos. And the next quilt is on the opposite end of the spectrum. This is a quilt, this is the most recent quilt that I finished. I haven't quilted it yet, but it's called Solace, and it's actually the quilt that is behind me. And it is that same format of a color grid, but a really toned down color palette for me. And finally, take a look at my auction quilt, which is called Vote. And if we look at that, back at the quilt that was called Wall of Sound, where trance was in the very center, there was a quilt, this quilt block is in that larger quilt also. I thought it was a really good auction quilt for this year because I really hope everyone will get out and vote.